From slave to sultan, the rise of Baibars. On a sweltering September day in 1260, a one-eyed warrior general faced what seemed to be the unconquerable force of his age, the Mongol army that had crushed everything in its path from China to Baghdad. But this was no ordinary general. Born a nomad, captured as a slave and sold in the markets of Damascus, he had risen to command the Egyptian army through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and sheer force of will. Now, on the blood-soaked fields of Ain Jalut, he would unleash a masterpiece of deception and courage that would halt the greatest invasion the world had ever seen. The remarkable journey of Baibars from slave to Sultan of Egypt would reshape the medieval world. While European crusaders reeled from his lightning campaigns and Mongol warriors whispered his name in fear, this former slave was busy building one of history's most sophisticated intelligence networks, revolutionizing warfare and creating an empire that would last for centuries. His rise from the slave markets to the throne of Egypt reads like an epic tale of adventure, except every word of it is true. This is the story of the man who proved that destiny isn't given, it's taken. The rise of Baibars, from nomad to warrior king. The wind howled across the Kipchak steppes in the winter of 1223, carrying with it rumors of an approaching apocalypse. Somewhere in these vast grasslands, beneath the endless Asian sky, a child was born who would one day shake the foundations of empires. The Kipchak nomads who welcomed him into their yurt could not have known that this boy, whom they would name Baibars, Great Panther, would one day rule lands they had never seen. Life among the Kipchak was harsh but free. Young Baibars learned to ride before he could walk, to shoot a bow from horseback before he could read, and to survive in a world where strength meant life and weakness meant death. The nomads lived in a delicate balance with the steppes, following the rhythms of seasons that had governed their ancestors for millennia. Their poetry sang of warrior heroes, their legends told of great khans, and their dreams were as vast as the horizons that surrounded them. But in the distance, another force was gathering, one that would shatter this ancient way of life forever. The first signs came as whispers carried by merchants, tales of entire cities put to the sword, of armies vanishing like morning mist, of a new power rising in the east. The Mongols were coming. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan's brilliant generals, they moved across the steppes like a storm, absorbing or destroying everything in their path. The Kipchak warriors, fierce as they were, found themselves facing an enemy that fought with the precision of a machine and the ferocity of a force of nature. In the chaos of a raid that would forever alter his destiny, young Baibars suffered the wound that would become his most distinctive feature, a blow that left him with his famous scarred eye. The same raid that marked his face would tear him from his homeland, sending him tumbling into the slave markets of Damascus. But the Mongols, in their triumph, had made a crucial mistake. In attempting to destroy the Kipchak way of life, they had instead tempered its finest warrior into a weapon that would one day turn against them. As he was led away in chains, Baibars carried with him more than just the physical scars of his homeland. He took with him the Kipchak traditions of horsemanship and archery, the cunning learned from countless games of strategy played around nomad fires, and most importantly, the burning ambition of a people who measured wealth not in gold, but in freedom. These were the gifts of the steppes, gifts that would prove far more valuable than their givers could have imagined. The rise of Baibars, from slave to warrior leader. The The slave markets of Damascus in 1242 were a symphony of misery conducted in a dozen languages. Merchants from Venice to Samarkand haggled over human lives beneath striped awnings, while servants sprinkled water on the stones to keep the desert heat at bay. In this bustling marketplace of flesh, a one-eyed youth stood out, not for his injury, but for the way he carried himself. Even in chains, Baibars moved like a predator. The Ayyubid princes of Syria had developed a sophisticated eye for military talent. Their agents prowled the market, searching not just for strong bodies, but for that indefinable quality that separated great warriors from mere soldiers. When they spotted Baibars, they recognized something exceptional. Here was a youth who watched the guards' movements with tactical precision, who studied the market's layout like a general surveying a battlefield. Most slaves kept their eyes down. This one was memorizing escape routes. Al-Salih Ayyub, Sultan of Egypt, had revolutionized the Mamluk system. Unlike his predecessors, who merely collected warrior slaves, he was building an elite army that would transform the face of warfare. His agents purchased Baibars for a sum that would have bought 10 ordinary slaves. But even this astronomical price would prove to be the bargain of the century. The barracks of the Mamluks bore little resemblance to any ordinary slave quarters. These were more like the training grounds of an elite military academy. Here, young warriors learned not just the arts of war, but mathematics, Islamic law, and the complex etiquette of court politics. The system was brutal but meritocratic. A man's birth meant nothing, his abilities everything. For someone raised in the egalitarian traditions of the steppes, it was a paradox that made perfect sense. Baibars approached his training with the same intensity he had once applied to surviving winter storms on the steppes. He mastered the curved sword of the Arabs as thoroughly as he had the composite bow of his ancestors. His fellow Mamluks began to notice something unusual about their new companion. He never seemed to sleep. While others rested, he could be found practicing sword forms by moonlight or studying military treatises by candlelight. The Kipchak boy was transforming himself into something unprecedented, a warrior who could outfight the strongest and outthink the smartest. But perhaps his greatest talent was one no teacher could impart: the ability to inspire loyalty. In a world where every ambitious Mamluk dreamed of his own kingdom, Baibars built something far more valuable: a network of brothers bound by ties stronger than blood. These relationships, forged in the training grounds of Cairo, would one day reshape the political landscape of the entire Middle East. The rise of Baibars, master of power and warfare. The first time Baibars killed a man, it wasn't with a sword. It was with a chess move. The year was 1250, and the political game being played in Cairo's corridors of power made the training ground battles look like children's sport. A rival officer had maneuvered to have Baibars' units sent on what amounted to a suicide mission. Instead of refusing or complaining, Baibars accepted the assignment with such enthusiasm that his enemy grew careless, revealing his broader conspiracy against Sultan Ayyub. By morning, the plotter's head adorned a spike, and Baibars had learned his most important lesson. In Egypt, battlefield prowess was only half the game. The decade that followed would prove to be a masterclass in power. While other Mamluks focused solely on their military training, Baibars created an informal intelligence network that stretched from the palace kitchens to the merchant caravans. He recruited forgotten people, slaves, traders, beggars, transforming them into his eyes and ears. Information, he discovered, could be sharper than any blade. During the day, he dazzled his superiors with innovations in cavalry tactics. His signature technique involved a complex series of false retreats that turned apparent defeat into devastating victory. But it was during the nights that he crafted his masterpiece. In lamplit rooms, surrounded by maps and messages, he pieced together the true state of the Muslim world. He saw what others missed. The Mongols weren't just another army. They were an existential threat to civilization itself. This understanding drove him to reinvent warfare. Traditional Muslim armies relied heavily on individual warrior prowess, but Baibars developed a system of signal flags that allowed thousands of horsemen to move as one. He adapted Mongol tactics but added his own refinements. His riders learned to shoot arrows accurately at full gallop, but also to coordinate their shots to create lethal arrow storms that could darken the sky. Yet his most remarkable achievement was invisible to most observers. Within the Mamluk barracks, he built something unprecedented, a brotherhood that transcended the usual ethnic and political divisions. Future sultans would discover too late that their elite guards were more loyal to the one-eyed commander than to the throne itself. While others collected titles, Baibars collected sworn swords and secrets. The final test of his transformation came during a border skirmish with Crusader forces near Gaza. Commanding his first independent operation, Baibars found his unit surrounded by a superior force. Rather than retreat, he launched an attack so bold that Christian chronicles would later claim he had summoned demonic assistance. The reality was more impressive. He had simply understood the psychology of his opponents better than they understood themselves. The victory earned him widespread fame, but more importantly, it proved his theories about warfare in practice. The shadow of power, Baibars' rise in 13th century Cairo. Sultan Aybak's court in 1254, Cairo was a glittering death trap. Behind every silk curtain lurked an assassin. Every cup of wine might carry poison, and every smile masked ulterior motives. Into this serpent's nest stepped Baibars, now a commander of increasing renown. While others saw the intrigue as a necessary evil, he approached it like a master playing an instrument, each move a note in a greater symphony of ambition. The first attempt on his life came, predictably, through seduction. A rival commander's sister, renowned for her beauty, invited him to a private dinner. Baibars attended, ate nothing, charmed everyone, and left with not only his life but also a new set of allies. The would-be assassin wound up becoming one of his most loyal supporters. It was classic Baibars, turning a trap into a triumph. Power in Cairo flowed through unexpected channels. While other commanders focused on currying favor with the Sultan, Baibars cultivated relationships with the merchant guilds that kept the empire's economy running. He turned Cairo's spice merchants into his personal intelligence network, its shipwrights into his military engineers, and its grain dealers into his logistical officers. By 1255, he controlled more of Egypt's true power than most of the Sultan's official advisors. The assassination of Turanshah marked the turning point. When the last Ayyubid Sultan was murdered in his bath, chaos erupted in the streets of Cairo. Every ambitious Mamluk commander saw an opportunity to seize the throne. But Baibars did something unexpected. He stepped back into the shadows. While others fought openly for power, he positioned himself as the indispensable kingmaker, the commander whose support would legitimize any claim to the throne. This restraint puzzled his rivals until it was too late to matter. Each time a new sultan rose to power, Baibars gained more influence while appearing to remain perfectly loyal. He turned down offers of high office, preferring to command his increasingly elite cavalry units. But those who looked closely noticed that these units always seemed to be stationed at strategically crucial points around the city. The true genius of his approach became apparent during the succession crisis of 1259. When Qutuz seized power, Baibars publicly supported him with such convincing loyalty that he was entrusted with even greater military authority. Privately, he was preparing for the moment when loyalty would no longer serve his purposes. His network of supporters now extended from Alexandria to Damascus, and his military innovations had transformed the Mamluk army into a force that could challenge even the mighty Mongols. The Mongol Storm, a turning point in history. Baghdad burned for 40 days. The waters of the Tigris ran black with the ink of destroyed books and red with the blood of scholars. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, had just obliterated the capital of the Islamic world. The caliph's head rolled in the dust, ending 5 centuries of Abbasid rule. The year was 1258, and civilization itself seemed to be ending. From his position in Cairo, Baibars watched the approaching catastrophe with the calculating eye of a master strategist. While others saw only destruction in the Mongol advance, he recognized opportunity. Every refugee who fled to Egypt brought vital intelligence about Mongol tactics. Every terrified diplomat carried maps of newly conquered territories. In the chaos of collapse, Baibars built the most comprehensive understanding of the Mongol war machine outside of the Khan's own generals. The Mongol message to Cairo was characteristically blunt: submit or die. Sultan Qutuz read the threat before his assembled commanders, many of whom favored immediate surrender. After all, no power had successfully resisted the Mongol advance. The debate raged through the palace until Baibars stepped forward with a proposal so audacious it silenced the chamber. Not only should Egypt resist, but they should strike first. What followed was a masterpiece of military preparation disguised as chaos. While Cairo seemingly panicked, Baibars methodically positioned troops and supplies. He planted false intelligence suggesting Egyptian weakness, knowing it would reach Mongol spies. His own network of informants tracked the Mongol advance, while his engineers modified Egyptian siege equipment based on refugee accounts of Mongol tactics. The key insight came from an unexpected source: a Chinese prisoner who had served in the Mongol artillery units. Over wine, he revealed crucial details about Mongol battlefield communication methods. Baibars immediately began training his men to disrupt these very signals, practicing under the cover of night in the desert outside Cairo. Each cavalry unit memorized specific counter-tactics, preparing for a battle plan that existed only in their commander's mind. When Hulagu Khan unexpectedly withdrew the bulk of his forces to attend a succession dispute in Mongolia, he left his general Kitbuka with orders to continue the advance. The Mongol commander, full of contempt for his Arab opponents, pushed toward Egypt with supreme confidence. He had no way of knowing that every step of his march had been anticipated and planned for by a former slave who had studied his people's tactics for years. As the Mongol army approached, tension gripped Cairo. But those close to Baibars noticed something odd. The calmer the situation became, the more he smiled. In his private quarters, he spent hours studying a detailed clay model of the terrain where he planned to meet the invaders. When a scout finally reported the Mongol army's approach toward Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, Baibars reportedly knocked over the clay model with a sweep of his hand. "Now," he said, "we improvise." Triumph at Ain Jalut, the turning point, against the Mongols. Dawn broke over Ain Jalut on September 3, 1260, revealing an empty valley. The Mongol general Kitbuka stood at its edge, scanning the terrain with growing frustration. His scouts had promised him the Egyptian army was here, yet he saw nothing but morning mist rising from the springs. Then, through the haze, he spotted a small contingent of Mamluk cavalry. As he watched, they charged forward, launched a few arrows, and retreated in apparent disorder. Kitbuka smiled. This would be even easier than expected. The Mongol commander gave the order to advance, sending his elite cavalry in pursuit of what appeared to be poorly disciplined Arab horsemen. His troops charged forward with the confidence of warriors who had never known defeat. They followed the retreating Egyptians through the valley, past the springs, and into the narrow passage beyond. Only then did Kitbuka realize his mistake. The mist hadn't been morning dew. It was water deliberately sprayed across the ground to conceal the true nature of the terrain. Baibars had spent the night positioning his forces in the hills above the valley. Now, at his signal, hidden drums began to beat. The retreating Egyptian cavalry suddenly wheeled around, their apparent disorder transforming into perfect formation. Before the Mongols could regroup, the hills erupted with Baibars' main force, thousands of cavalry warriors he had trained personally in the art of mounted archery. The battle that followed would change the course of history. Baibars had studied the Mongol system of military whistles and horns, and now he turned their own tactics against them. His men disrupted Mongol communication signals while executing complex maneuvers that seemed to defy the chaos of battle. Every time the Mongols attempted to form their traditional crescent formation, they found themselves advancing into carefully prepared killing zones. As noon approached, Kitbuka played what he thought was his trump card, his elite personal guard, veterans of countless victories. They charged directly at the Egyptian center, seeking to split Baibars' army in two. It was exactly what Baibars had been waiting for. His own elite units, hidden in prepared positions, struck the Mongol flanks. The trap was sprung with such precision that Christian chronicles later described it as like watching a dance where every step had been choreographed by demons. Kitbuka died fighting, refusing to retreat even when the battle was clearly lost. By sunset, the invincible Mongol army lay shattered. Baibars had achieved what no other commander had managed. He had beaten the Mongols at their own game of mobility and deception. The Spring of Goliath had witnessed David's triumph once again. But even in the midst of celebration, Baibars was planning his next move. While others saw Ain Jalut as an ending, the halt of Mongol expansion, he recognized it as a beginning. He had given the Muslim world something it desperately needed, proof that the Mongols could be beaten. More importantly, he had given his men something even more valuable, the unshakable confidence that came from achieving the impossible. The rise and reign of Baibars, a revolutionary sultan. Victory has killed more men than defeat. Sultan Qutuz learned this lesson too late as he rode triumphantly back to Cairo after Ain Jalut. The blade that ended his life came not from a Mongol warrior, but from the hand of his most successful commander. Baibars struck with the same precision he had shown on the battlefield, transforming from loyal general to Sultan of Egypt in the space of a single sword stroke. The assassination was merely the opening move in a game of political chess that Baibars had spent years preparing. Within hours of Qutuz's death, key positions throughout Cairo were already occupied by loyal commanders. The city's gates, treasuries, and armories fell under his control before most citizens even knew their sultan was dead. Those who might have opposed him found themselves quietly surrounded by veterans of Ain Jalut, men who owed their lives and fortunes to Baibars' military genius. But it was what happened next that truly revealed his political mastery. Rather than purging the old regime, Baibars offered his rivals a choice that no previous sultan had considered: honest partnership in exchange for honest loyalty. He transformed potential enemies into stakeholders in a new political order, one built on competence rather than heredity. The son of a slave had reimagined the very nature of Islamic governance. His coronation in 1260 shattered precedent. Previous sultans had draped themselves in religious legitimacy, claiming descent from noble Arab lineages. Baibars did something far bolder. He presented himself as the sword arm of Islam itself. When he learned that a surviving member of the Abbasid dynasty had escaped the Mongol sack of Baghdad, he seized the opportunity. He installed the Abbasid prince as caliph in Cairo, then promptly had himself proclaimed sultan by his puppet caliph, creating a perfect circle of legitimacy. His first acts as sultan revealed the blueprint for an empire. He established a sophisticated postal system that could deliver messages from Cairo to Damascus in 4 days, a speed that would not be surpassed until the invention of the telegraph. This wasn't mere administrative efficiency. It was the backbone of the most sophisticated intelligence network the medieval world had ever seen. His pigeons carried messages, his merchants carried secrets, and his system of signal fires could transmit warnings from the Syrian frontier to Egypt faster than an army could march. But perhaps his most remarkable innovation was the transformation of the Mamluk system itself. Previous sultans had treated their military slaves as disposable assets. Baibars revolutionized the institution, creating a true meritocracy where talent and loyalty were rewarded with power and position. He established schools, built mosques, and created a system of social mobility that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The slave had not merely become sultan, he had rewritten the rules of what a sultan could be. Baibars, the empire builder. The Crusader fortress of Crac des Chevaliers was considered impregnable until Baibar proved otherwise. In 1271, he captured the mighty castle using a forged letter that convinced its defenders to surrender. This wasn't just military victory, it was psychological warfare elevated to an art form. The Sultan, who had once sold messages in the slave markets of Damascus, now wielded deceit like a master swordsman. His campaigns moved with lightning speed that defied the logistics of medieval warfare. In a single season, he might strike at Armenia, vanish into the desert, then suddenly appear at the gates of a Crusader city hundreds of miles away. The secret lay in his revolutionary supply system, a network of pre-positioned arsenals and food stores that allowed his armies to travel light and fast. His opponents would spend weeks gathering armies and supplies, only to find Baibars had already come and gone, leaving destruction in his wake. But it was in peacetime that his true genius emerged. He transformed Egypt's economy through a series of radical reforms. The traditional IQTA system of land grants was reorganized to reward competence rather than nobility. He standardized weights and measures across the empire, established a uniform currency, and created a sophisticated system of commercial courts that gave merchants unprecedented legal protections. Trade flourished under rules that applied equally to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. His spy network grew into something unprecedented in medieval history. He established a system of civilian informants so extensive that a popular saying claimed, "The Sultan's birds perch on every shoulder." But unlike previous rulers who used intelligence purely for control, Baibars created a two-way flow of information. His reforms were often responses to problems reported through this network, allowing him to address issues before they became crises. The construction projects he launched would reshape the face of the Middle East. He rebuilt the walls of Cairo, constructed a naval arsenal that would make Egypt a Mediterranean power, and established a series of desert fortifications linked by his famous signal fire network. Each fortress was designed to be self-sufficient, with its own wells and granaries. Together, they formed an early warning system that could alert Egypt to invasion hours or days before an enemy arrived. Innovation marked every aspect of his rule. He reorganized the army into specialized units, dedicated archer corps, siege specialists, and the famous fast-moving cavalry that could strike anywhere in the empire within days. His naval reforms created a fleet that could challenge European maritime power. He established diplomatic relations with powers as distant as the Golden Horde and the Byzantine Empire, playing potential enemies against each other with consummate skill. But perhaps his most lasting achievement was psychological. He transformed the Sultanate from a defensive power into an empire that could project force across vast distances. His subjects began to see themselves not as the survivors of Mongol expansion, but as the inheritors of a new golden age. The slave markets where he had once stood in chains now traded in luxury goods from India and China. The empire he built would outlast him by centuries, its foundations laid not just in military might, but in revolutionary ideas about what governance could achieve. The architect of victory, Baibars' legacy of innovation and strength. The Sultan's architects trembled when Baibars inspected their work. He had an uncanny eye for structural weaknesses, born from years of siege warfare. At one inspection of Cairo's new walls, he stopped, pointed to a seemingly solid section, and ordered it torn down. The rebuilt portion later withstood an earthquake that damaged adjacent sectors. The former slave had developed not just an eye for military advantage, but an almost supernatural sense for lasting achievement. His greatest architectural triumph was the transformation of Cairo itself. The city became a laboratory for innovative construction techniques that combined beauty with military precision. His mosques featured revolutionary pendentive domes that seemed to float on air, while concealing murder holes and defensive positions. The Al-Zahir Baibars Mosque, completed in 1268, was more than a house of worship. It was a statement in stone about the fusion of cultural sophistication with martial strength. While his predecessors had built palaces, Baibars built infrastructure. He dredged canals, constructed bridges, and established a system of public fountains that brought fresh water to Cairo's poorest districts. His engineers developed new methods of flood control that transformed the Nile's annual floods from a disaster into a managed resource. These projects employed thousands, creating a new class of skilled craftsmen and engineers who would influence Islamic architecture for centuries. The sea itself bent to his will. His naval architects revolutionized ship design, creating vessels that could sail closer to the wind than any contemporary European craft. The port of Alexandria was transformed with the construction of a new lighthouse and breakwater system that made it the safest harbor in the Mediterranean. His naval arsenal could produce ships at a rate that seemed miraculous to foreign observers, using standardized parts and assembly techniques that wouldn't become common in Europe for centuries. Culture flourished under his reign in unexpected ways. The man who had learned to read late in life became one of history's great patrons of literature. His court attracted scholars from across the Islamic world, creating a renaissance in arts and sciences. He established the Zahiriya library, which became one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world. But true to his practical nature, many of these scholars also served in his intelligence network, their academic travels providing cover for gathering information. His most lasting innovation was in military architecture. The fortresses he built were not just defensive strongpoints. They were self-contained cities that could survive extended sieges. Each incorporated its own mills, workshops, and water sources. The fortress of Carrick was rebuilt with such sophisticated defensive features that it remained impregnable for centuries. These castles served as both military bases and centers of civilian administration, creating focal points for regional development. In Alexandria, he did something unprecedented. He created an underwater defense system using sunken obstacles and chains that could be raised to trap enemy ships. The harbor's entrance was protected by a series of towers equipped with his latest innovation, giant crossbows that could launch heavy projectiles with devastating accuracy. When a Crusader fleet approached in 1271, they found themselves facing defense systems no European engineer had ever encountered. The Sultan's Shadow, the legacy of Sultan Baibars. Death came for Sultan Baibars not on the battlefield, but in Damascus in the summer of 1277. Legend claims he drank from a poisoned cup meant for another, a fitting end for a man who had orchestrated so many such deaths himself. In his final moments, witnesses reported that he smiled and whispered something about the symmetry of fate. The one-eyed slave who had transformed himself into an empire builder died as he had lived, on his own terms. His final campaign had been his most ambitious. At the age of 54, when most medieval rulers would have been content to rest on their laurels, Baibars launched an invasion of Anatolia that penetrated deeper into Turkish territory than any Arab army had ever reached. The campaign showcased all his tactical brilliance, lightning cavalry strikes, sophisticated logistics, and brilliant deception. He died undefeated, having expanded his empire to its greatest territorial extent. The system he built proved more durable than anyone expected. While other medieval states collapsed into civil war after their founder's death, the Mamluk Sultanate continued to function smoothly. His administrative reforms had created something unprecedented, a state that could survive its sultan's death. The bureaucracy continued to collect taxes, the postal service delivered messages, and the frontier fortresses maintained their vigilant watch. His military innovations transformed warfare beyond the Islamic world. European crusaders who had faced his armies brought his tactics back to their homelands. His system of mounted archers would influence cavalry warfare for centuries. His siege techniques were studied and copied by military engineers from Constantinople to London. The Mamluk military system he perfected would produce warriors so formidable that even gunpowder weapons initially proved ineffective against them. Perhaps his most surprising legacy was diplomatic. The network of alliances and trade relationships he established created a framework for international relations that survived well into the modern era. His treaty with the Byzantine Empire became a model for Muslim-Christian diplomatic agreements. The commercial courts he established influenced the development of international trade law. Even his enemies adopted his innovations in diplomatic protocol and intelligence gathering. The shadow of the one-eyed sultan fell across centuries. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, his soldiers found themselves fighting an army that still used cavalry tactics Baibars had developed. The citadels he built remained military strongpoints into the modern era. The administrative systems he created influenced Middle Eastern governance well into the 20th century. Even today, the buildings he constructed dominate the skyline of Cairo. But his true legacy was not in stone or systems, but in possibility. He had proved that a slave could rise to rule an empire, that innovation could defeat superior numbers, that civilization could be sophisticated and strong simultaneously. In an age of rigid hierarchies, he created a meritocracy that drew talent from every level of society. The slave markets where he had once stood in chains became, under his rule, centers of international trade that would enrich Egypt for centuries. The legacy of Baibars, echoes of a sultan's vision. In the spring of 2011, Egyptian protesters gathered in Tahrir Square, taking shelter behind medieval walls that Baibars had built nearly 8 centuries earlier. The fortifications that had once defended against Mongol armies now protected a new generation fighting for their future. History echoes in strange ways. The slave who became sultan would have appreciated the irony. Modern military theorists study Baibars' campaigns with growing fascination. His emphasis on speed, deception, and information warfare seems remarkably prescient in an age of digital conflict. The NSA's internal handbook once quoted his famous maxim, "Information is a weapon that never needs reloading." His integration of intelligence networks with military operations established principles that modern cyber warfare units still follow, though they may not know their origin. The international system still bears his fingerprints. The diplomatic protocol he established between Egypt and the Italian maritime republics evolved into elements of modern international law. His revolutionary concept of protected foreign merchants, guaranteed safe passage regardless of conflicts between their nations, helped establish principles that would later be codified in the Geneva Conventions. Urban planners studying sustainable desert cities have begun re-examining his water management systems. The network of wells, cisterns, and aqueducts he built created a model of desert urbanization that worked without modern technology. His solutions to water scarcity, underground storage, careful rationing, and sophisticated distribution systems offer lessons for a warming world facing similar challenges. In the halls of power, his methods remain relevant. Modern intelligence agencies recognize in his network of merchants, scholars, and diplomats the blueprint for contemporary human intelligence operations. His system of rapid communication through relay stations established principles of information management that social media networks would reinvent centuries later. But perhaps his most enduring legacy lies in what he proved possible. The slave who became sultan demonstrated that systems of rigid hierarchy could be broken, that merit could triumph over birth, that innovation could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. His life remains a testament to the power of human potential unleashed, a reminder that history's greatest changes often come from its most unlikely sources. The one-eyed slave who transformed himself into a sultan transformed much more than just his own fate. He created an empire, reshaped warfare, revolutionized administration, and established principles of governance that would influence centuries of rulers. But above all, he proved that the circumstances of one's birth need not determine the impact of one's life. In the end, Baibars' greatest achievement may have been this. He showed that power flows not from heredity or wealth, but from the capacity to imagine a different world and the will to make that vision real. In doing so, he wrote not just his own unlikely story, but a new chapter in human possibility, one that continues to resonate across the centuries, challenging us to imagine what else might be possible.